Hockey Time Machine. I'm Glenn Dreyfus. Between 1988 and 2014, our guest tonight worked as a hockey researcher for U.S. TV networks at 7 different Olympic Games. ABC in Calgary, CBS in France, Norway, and Japan, and NBC in Salt Lake City, Vancouver, and in Russia. And he doesn't just do TV work. Here's his book. He's written this one about years of globetrotting called Hockey, My Door to Europe, which we will delve into more as we move along. So Denis Gibbons, welcome to Hockey Time Machine.
Thank you very much, Glenn.
How does one get to be a researcher for the U.S. broadcasts of Winter Olympic hockey?
To go back to my childhood, I was a great fan of the St. Michael's Majors junior team in the 1950s and 60s. Father Barr was the coach. They won the Memorial Cup in 1961. Father Barr, of course, went on to become coach of Canada's national team and was facing the Soviet Union at the World Championships and Olympics every year. They kept losing. I thought it was a fluke. I thought it was bad refereeing. When they lost 6 times in a row, I knew it was a lot more than a fluke and that the Soviets were actually very competitive. So I started following their hockey, and I started following it more closely in 1972 with the Summit Series. So when the ABC TV network was preparing for its coverage of the 1988 Olympics in Calgary, they sent a producer to Calgary in advance of the tournament and asked for advice from Hockey Canada if they could recommend somebody who knew a lot about international hockey, that they could use a researcher to work with Ken Dryden and Al Michaels. And that's how it all started.
What are the duties of an Olympic hockey TV researcher? And if you say research, I'm going to end this interview.
Okay. We travel, and we get there 1 full week before the Olympics starts. All of the teams are practicing every day. They're even having some controlled scrimmages against each other. Our job during that time is to go to the practices, talk to as many players and coaches as we possibly can to get inside information about the players and teams. Also to talk to journalists from these other countries to see what their perspective is. When the tournament starts, I sit, of course, with the announcers and pass them notes during the game coverage, information, biographical info on the players, statistical stuff, and anything that I observe on the ice or in the audience.
At NBC have learned to trust his information implicitly. So as you look back at all your Olympics, not just the ones with Mike.
That's me with Mike Emmerich of NBC on the left, and Eddie Olczyk, the color man. Eddie used to play for the Maple Leafs, of course. Yeah, the one that I liked the best was at the 1992 Olympics in France. Czechoslovakia was playing the United States. They had a college team there too in the bronze medal game. The Czechs were heavy favorites, but they weren't all that confident that they could win. It's very common for teams ahead of a showdown game to have liquor or beer or champagne ordered before the game just in case they win. But the Czechs were not all that confident, and they did not do it. Anyway, they're leading the United States 4-2 at the end of the second period, and I'm stationed down in the corridors near the Czech dressing room. I understood a little bit of the Czech language, and I overheard the coach say to the trainer, "You forgot to order the champagne." And the trainer said back to him, "Don't worry about it. There's a store right across the road." So he went back across the road and got the champagne and brought it back. I immediately wired John Davidson, who was at the broadcast position, and our color man, and they got a video camera down there, and we showed the champagne being brought into the dressing room with one period still to go.
Crisis averted, huh?
Yes.
That's a good story. You've witnessed Olympic hockey with so-called amateurs, some quasi, and with the injection of NHL players. Which version do you favor, having watched them both in person, and why?
Oh, I prefer the Olympics with the NHL players there because I want to see the best play against the best. I did see some very good games in the years before the NHL started participating, but the tempo of the games, the quality and the skill took a huge jump forward when the NHL came in 1998. And I think in the years that the Soviets won gold medals against our amateur players, I don't think they really felt that they won anything.
One last question about Olympic hockey. A chapter in your book, Hockey My Door to Europe, is titled Women Sacrifice More to Go for Gold. Explain to me why that is.
Well, they work harder. As a researcher, uh, women who haven't had that much exposure to the media over the years are more appreciative. When you interview them, they are more honest with their comments. They're more appreciative. They have worked very hard to where they are at that point with very little monetary um, rewards, and they appreciate the chance to go there, where some of our pro players do not. Um, the only small problem with women's hockey, of course, is that we only have about 4 top level nations in the world right now, and actually only 2. The gold medal game almost always comes down to Canada versus the United States. Finland and Sweden are close sometimes. The Czech Republic is getting closer, but we need to get a more competitive tournament for the women. But they work hard as anybody, and they deserve all the credit.
As you pointed out, with pros, now the NHL can feed players to all the different national teams that participate in the Olympics, which strengthens Sweden and Finland and Norway and so on, and Russia and all of the teams in Europe. There's no corresponding pro women's league, uh, which is now trying to find its footing in North America. So is that what in Europe causes the disparity? Because the women's ice hockey programs, well, let me just ask you, what is the state of women's hockey country by country in Europe as far as you know?
They all have leagues, and in fact, the Russians have a league which pays more money than the league in Canada, or the I'm sorry, the league in North America, which is most of its teams in the professional women's league in North America are in the United States. We have a couple in Canada. This season, of course, we had the 2 largest contracts in history. One player signed for 80,000 and another for 150,000. So it's changing. But in Russia, they've had a lucrative professional league for 5 or 6 years. And by their standard of living, the players over there in that league, it's a full-time job. They don't have to hold another job. The only negative part is that they're playing. It's mostly Russians against Russians, although there are a few imports, and the quality of their play is not improving because they're not getting that competition against the United States and Canada, except for once a year in the World Championships. But as far as a standard of living and making money, they're doing very well. Sweden also has a pretty good league. Finland and the Czech Republic, lesser leagues, and also they all have leagues, but the place where you can actually earn a living is Russia.
Dennis, I'm going to be scatter shooting with you now, topics for the rest of our conversation. I'm going to bring up names and topics either from your book or other articles you've written, and I'm then going to let you tell their stories. The first one, and please correct me on the pronunciation, Viktor Kotyulev.
Hatulev, Victor
Okay.
Hatulev.
You wrote about him in the Hockey News as, quote, the Russian NHL trailblazer you've probably never heard of. What is his story?
He was the first Soviet player ever drafted by an NHL team. He played in the 1975 World Junior Championship in Winnipeg. And in those days, it was not an official IIHF tournament, but the Soviet Union won the gold medal and he was the star of the team. So Philadelphia drafted him. And that was at a time in 1975 where the transfer of players from the Soviet Union to North America was totally unheard of. He never did play for Philadelphia, and he was a hell of a player. He was big, fast, and tough. Unfortunately, his life took a turn for the bad. He picked up a drinking habit and wound up hitting a referee in a Soviet League game, was suspended for the rest of his life, and very, very sadly died as a drunk on the streets of one of the large cities over there. So it was a great waste of talent, but it goes back apparently in his family history to the loss of either his father or grandfather at an early age, a person who had a great positive influence on him. But he was just a little bit too early. The first Soviet player to come officially didn't happen until 1989 with Sergei Pryakin coming to Calgary. So this was in the late 70s, and at that time the officials in the Kremlin were not allowing their players to come.
Was the Flyers drafting of this player, did that have anything to do with Fred Sherrill making a trip over to Russia? Which came first in the sequence of events? Were they connected, or was this just the Flyers taking a, pardon the expression, flyer?
I wouldn't be surprised that there was a follow up to that. I was with Fred Sherrill on the study trip to Moscow in the summer of 1974 when we took lessons at the Institute of Sport and Physical Culture, and we took on the ice lessons at an ice arena over there. Fred had just won his first Stanley Cup in May of 74. So instead of heading out to the golf course to relax, he said, I've won the Stanley Cup, but I need to know more about hockey. And he signed up for this study tour, 3-week study tour, which was sponsored by Concordia University in Montreal. He went over there and learned a lot more about how they played the game. He also gave lectures. Now, this drafting of Hatula came just about a year or two later, so I'm sure that Sherrill was recommending this, yes.
And you tell a story relating what Shero said when he was in Russia. He got asked about how he conducted and how the NHL conducts practices.
Oh, yes. Well, in the NHL, not so much in those days, but nowadays the players are king. They work if they want to, and if they don't feel like working, they don't, and nothing happens because they have such big contracts. But in those days, Sherrill was coaching at Omaha in the Central League, it was a farm club of the New York Rangers, and the Russians asked him, how do you conduct a practice? Now, the Soviets, of course, were at a strict regimen, and you either followed the coach's orders or you hit the road. What Sherrill told them, he says, well, the first thing I do, I blow my whistle, call all the players together, and I ask them, do you want to do some work? And he said, if they say yes, we do. If not, we don't. And the Soviets were totally amazed. Said that would never happen over here.
And when Shero said that, he had someone in mind, didn't he? Alan Eagleson?
Probably, because Eagleson's rise to power was just beginning as the organizer of the union. I probably that's true, yes.
And speaking of Eagleson, who, yes, was the head of the NHL Players Association as well as being a player agent, you tell a story specifically about him. Do you remember why Eagleson once left a blank check at the front desk of a Helsinki hotel?
Yes. 1982 World Championships, Canada sent a team with NHL players, including Wayne Gretzky. It came down to the final day. It was a different format in those days. It was a single round robin. There was no playoffs in like quarterfinals, semifinals, no knockout games. It was a single round robin. The medals were decided on the final standings. And going into the final day, Canada had already lost to the Soviets and the Czechoslovaks, but they could still get the silver medal if the Soviets beat the Czechoslovaks, and they should have beaten them on the strength of their team. But the Soviets played like they didn't care, and the game finished in a 0-0 tie, and Czechoslovakia picked up the single point they needed to get the silver medal and relegating Canada to bronze. Some of the Canadian players and Eagleson watched the game, and they accused the Soviets of actually throwing the game because the Czechoslovaks, of course, were their communist brothers in those days, and they wanted to see the Czechoslovaks in second place instead of Canada. So the Canadian players were so mad that when they got back to the Hesperia Hotel in Helsinki, they tore everything apart. It caused a lot of damage, for which the Team Canada was responsible. And before heading for the airport, Eagleson left a blank check to cover all the damage.
Before we leave Fred Sharrow, there are different ways to look at Sharrow's record. He's in the Hall of Fame as a builder. Some see him as an innovator, somebody who did go over to Russia when anyone had that opportunity, but he was the only NHL coach to go. Others see him as the architect of a style of hockey that almost destroyed the sport on the NHL level, some people feel. So, what is your thinking about how, in the aggregate, we should look at the legacy of Fred Sharrow?
Well, there's certainly two sides to the story. You're quite right there. He was the first NHL coach I saw to tell his players to circle back with the puck, the same as the Soviets did, and to keep the puck moving all the time rather than just charging forward. And they had great teamwork, but at the same time, they were bullies. They played dirty hockey, and in my opinion, they got away with murder through the tolerance of the NHL. The NHL officials called practically nothing against their players. And for a few years, hockey was going downhill because junior teams were watching this and taking up the same style. So I certainly criticize them for allowing that kind of hockey, but I criticize the league officials more for allowing it to happen. They could have put a stop to it by just calling the penalties. But at the same time, he did introduce some techniques that the Soviets were using that the NHL made quite useful in the future.
As you point out in your book, Sharrow himself did get beat up, but it was in a steam room. What was that all about?
Oh, well, this is the positive side of being involved in international hockey. You learn about the cultures of other countries, and in the Soviet Union, and even more so in Finland, this is even bigger in Finland. Taking saunas is a great traditional pastime, and after you go in the sauna and sweat all the toxins out of your body, you come out and you are lashed with big branches of a tree. It's supposed to be good for the body. So, and they serve you vodka at the same time. This is supposed to make a man out of you. So when Fred came back to our residence after having this procedure, he was telling us all about it, and he said the guy that was hitting him with the branches was about 6'6" and about 300 pounds. we all got a kick out of
that. More than he did.
Yes.
And then, amazingly, in your book, you have another encounter, a separate one, with another former NHL coach in a steam room. Who was that?
Well, everybody knows him by Grapes. He's retired now. But in the 2014 Olympics in Sochi, I was working for NBC, and Don Cherry, there he is on the screen with me in the arena in Sochi. He was working for CBC. We were both housed in the Azimut Hotel on the shores of the Black Sea, and I had some time off, and I went down to the basement to have a steam bath. I got into the steam bath, and I couldn't see 5 inches in front of me for all the steam. It felt very good, and you didn't want to stay in there too long, but you couldn't see what was happening. I saw that there was a person sitting on the bench across from me. All I saw was 2 feet and legs and a towel around this person. So I started a conversation and I said, "Are you working at the Olympics?" He says, "Yes." And I said, "For NBC?" And he said, "No." He said, "CBC." And I said, "What do you do?" Keep in mind that I could not see this person's face, only his feet and his legs and the towel. I said, "What do you do?" And a voice came back through all the steam and clouds. "I'm the star of Hockey Night in Canada." Sure enough, it was Don Cherry.
The steam apparently did not sweat the ego out of grapes.
I don't think so.
That's a funny story. What did you talk about after that?
Well, we talked a bit about the tournament, but the main thing he was interested in that he was anxious to get a hold of his girlfriend back in Canada, and he didn't know how to use the Russian phones and to deal with the operators who were speaking Russian. So that was the main thing on his mind. And so we went to the desk and we got it all arranged so that he could call home and see that everything was all right.
Let me switch gears now back to a couple more players I want to pluck out of obscurity that you have written about. One is Sweden's Ulf Sterner, kind of a pioneer in his own right, played 4 games with the Rangers. But as you tell us, he got the cold shoulder even from his own teammates. Why?
This is as far back as 1964. This is over 50 years ago. And there had been no European players in the NHL at that time. Ulf Sterner, who was Sweden's best player in 1964, he came over to try out for the Rangers. They sent him down to the farm club at Omaha to start off, and Sherrill was coaching there. And I said, "How did that work out, Fred?" He said, "Well," he said, "he was Swedish. The Swedish had a reputation for being pansies on the ice." He said, "I fully expected the players on the opposition to go after him in the corners. But when our own players did in practice, I was astounded."
Why did they?
They didn't like the idea of a European player coming over and taking a job from them.
That's kind of repulsive.
Yes, um, it's not like that now. I think that they welcome if a good European player comes over, it's going to strengthen their team and take them to the Stanley Cup. I know Ovechkin's got a lot of criticism in Washington for being a friend of Vladimir Putin, but I don't think you're going to see any players on the Capitals wanting him kicked off the team because of his goal scoring prowess.
All right, let's go there. Much as we don't want to, it would be irresponsible in a show about international hockey not to tie in Russia's brutal war in Ukraine. And from a historical perspective, Dennis, you have written this quote: the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in 1979, yet the NHL still filled both the Soviets and their own pockets by allowing the 1979-80 Super Series against NHL clubs to continue. So if it was wrong then, what would be the right approach today?
Well, it's certainly true that Putin and Russia has illegally invaded Ukraine. The question for debate, and I haven't entirely made up my mind on this either. The debate is, because of that, should the NHL send Russian players home, not allow them? And on the other side of the coin, also, should the Canadian government bar Canadian players from playing in the KHL because we've got at least 30 Canadians over there earning as much as $1.5 million? But the war continues and doesn't seem to, it doesn't appear to be coming to any end. And I'm not sure what the answer is. I can tell you this, that a former Russian player was killed in the fighting in December in Ukraine. Player was not an outstanding player. He played only in the minor leagues in Russia. But at the end of his career, he was only 30 years old. He enlisted and went into the army and was killed in Ukraine. Another interesting point, when the war started in Ukraine in 2022, there were several Russian players playing in the Ukrainian league. And despite the fact that the Russians were invading his country, a Ukrainian coach made sure that those Russian players got safe passage out of Ukraine back to their own country. And at the same time, Russia was blocking corridors for evacuees from Ukraine who were trying to get out of the country. They were blocking them, and one of their coaches was making it easy for Russian players to get home. Personally, as I said, I haven't made up a final opinion about this, and it's a good point for debate. I recognize the fact that players do have a right to make a living, and if you're a Canadian who has had their final NHL contract terminated, they're early 30s, they're not going to get another one, and they're offered $1.5 million to go over there, it's hard to turn down. I don't know the answer, Glenn, but I'll leave it up for debate.
I am glad that you were willing to talk about it, because we shouldn't shy away from that. And as you say, there is a slippery slope aspect to this, and no country has completely clean hands on this. At the same time, some countries' actions are so beyond the pale that you can't just go with, well, whataboutism? You're not perfect either. Some things are just so bad, you have to take a stand, even if it means a personal sacrifice. But I agree, it's a complicated issue, but I appreciate you being willing to at least flesh out what some of the issues are.
Thank you.
There was Soviet hockey star Alexander Mogilny back when the Soviet Union wasn't allowing players to come to the NHL and to North America. Mogilny defected after the 1988 World Championship in Stockholm.
1989.
1989.
Yes.
What was the impact of Mogilny's leap and the players that followed him?
Well, I was at that World Championship in Stockholm in 1989, and the Soviet team was staying in a resort hotel in a little town called Dalarno. It was on the ocean to the south of Stockholm. And when the tournament was over, he walked out. And before walking out, he asked Sergei Fedorov, who became a great star with Detroit later, to come with him. But at that time, Fedorov declined. So Mogilny walked out himself. He was met over there by Jerry Meehan, who, by the way, is a cousin of mine and was a general manager of the Buffalo Sabres at that time. And Don Luce, who was with the team, they met them there and flew him over to Buffalo. He certainly boosted the level of play with the Sabres with his goal scoring. And I think he was welcomed by most of the teammates in Buffalo. Some may still have resented the fact that he was a European and taking a job away, but it was a very courageous move. And I got a chance to go down there because go down to Amherst, New York, where he was staying. That was his first residence. And I went down with Steve Dryden, who was editor of the Hockey News at that time, to interview him and the people that helped get him out. And it was quite an experience.
Let's focus for a second on a word you used, courage, because I don't think people can possibly comprehend fully just how courageous, just how much of a risk Mogilny and the players that followed him were taking by defecting, how much danger they and their families were in to make this leap to North America.
Yes, because in many cases for the players who did defect, there were repercussions against their families back home. Mogilny comes from Khabarovsk, which is in the far east of Russia, almost closer to Japan than it is to Western Europe. And I'm told that initially there were some repercussions against his family. However, in 1989, when he was the last player really that had to defect, because right about at the same time, the Soviet Ice Hockey Federation and the Soviet government in conjunction decided that it was time to allow players to come, but they wanted those players that were going to come to be players that were no longer useful to them. Fetisov, Makarov, Krutov, Larionov, players who had done an outstanding job for the Soviet Union and international hockey, but were now over the hill, so to speak. But you're certainly right in saying that there were a big risk, because I know Mogilny was very, very leery himself of going back to Russia until I think it took a couple of years before he did. And by that time, the Soviet Union had dissolved, and it was now just Russia. And he was now being treated rather as a hero than a traitor.
Let's talk about barnstorming teams from North America, specifically Canada, going the other way. Back to the early days of hockey, there were teams who went over for barnstorming and for tournaments into Europe. Of the teams that did that in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, are there any stories from that stand out, either memorable or unusual or special in some way?
Well, I know a little bit about the East York Lyndhursts from Toronto, who were the first team to play the Soviets in a world championship in 1954. In 1954, we had, as I say, Canada had never faced a Soviet team. They didn't really think they were that good. And so when they were asked to send a team, they selected the East York Lyndhursts, which were only a senior B team out of Toronto. I remember that they went over to the championships, and the games were outdoors, sometimes played in snow with the ice becoming very slushy. And surprisingly, they lost 7-2 to the Soviet national team in the final game. Now, some of the Lyndhurst players claimed that had the ice been a lot better, they could have they would have improved their own passing. They said that their passing and their shooting was negatively affected by all this slush on the ice. On the other hand, it was the same for both teams, but it was a clear statement that in the future Canada was going to have to send a lot better than senior B team over if they wanted to win a medal. And I remember Russ Robertson, who was a defenseman on that team, later became a car salesman at Georgetown, Ontario, telling me that the Lyndhurst took a ship back from Europe, docked in Montreal, and then they took a train to Toronto. The players were so embarrassed that those who lived in Toronto, they got off at the station in Scarborough rather than face their own fans at Union Station.
Oh, I don't think they needed to do that. In any case, in your view, North American players, when they go overseas, you don't think they take as much advantage as they should of the opportunity to immerse themselves in the local culture, right?
That's true. The whole theme of my book, Hockey, My Door to Europe, I've outlined all the marvelous experiences I've had away from the rink when I've gone over there, culturally, geographically, politically, and otherwise. And to me, I chose the title of the book, Hockey, My Door to Europe. It was hockey. Hockey was the vehicle that opened up my eyes to what was going on in the rest of the world. I interviewed Ulf Nilsson one time, a great Swedish star who played for the New York Rangers and the Winnipeg Jets. I talked to him at one of the Canada Cups in Montreal, and I said, "You've had a great career, Ulf. Is there anything that you regret about your career?" He says, "Probably the time I wasted playing cards in hotel rooms." So you're not just talking about Europe. NHL players have this door open to them even in North America. All the great cities with their remarkable history in North America, that if they're visiting these cities, they should get out and have a look around. But it's been a tradition. It's called team bonding. On an off day, let's get together and have a few beers and play cards in the room while the world goes by.
And yet, Dennis, it turned out to be a bad idea for you to go sightseeing in Czechoslovakia in 1983 with two cameras around your neck.
Yes, I must admit that was the one exception. I was over there with the Burlington Midgets, who were playing a tour and playing in a tournament in Schumpert, Czechoslovakia, a little town about 10 miles from the border of Poland. And on the edge of town, there was a Soviet military base. The Soviets had their military base close to the border of Poland and Czechoslovakia so that they could go either way in case of an uprising. The Czech guide we had told us in advance about the existence of this base there and said, whatever you do, do not go near it. They, in their view, they're there for a reason. They're protecting what they think is their rights. The people of the town, they have their own business. Neither one of them mixed with each other. But I didn't take the guy's advice. I thought that I was already a seasoned traveler, and I had studied some Russian at McMaster University, and I thought, if I get in any trouble, I'll be able to talk my way out of it. So I took my cameras and I wandered up near the base, which was on the edge of town. I did not take any pictures, but I was seriously considering it. All of a sudden, a little car pulls up and a guy steps out with a pork pie English style hat and flashes some credentials to me, which indicated to me that he was a member of the Czech secret police. He said, "You must come with me." And it was all downhill after that because I was trembling. And he took me down to the police station. They questioned me. They wanted to know why I was there. For the next 3 days, I was under house arrest. What it meant was that I could still stay in my hotel. I could still go to the hockey games, but I was not allowed to leave that town until it was cleared. So they came back for me 2 different days later. And finally, on the third day, they had a little trial for me and asked me several questions. They finally were convinced that I guess the tears in my eyes and my trembling hands indicated that I really was honest in saying it was only there for hockey. And I think the final nail in the coffin was that while I was outside the Soviet base, I had been wearing a bright orange and blue hockey jacket. Orange and blue were the colors of the Burlington Minor Hockey Association. And they came to the conclusion that no self-respecting spy would be caught dead in orange and blue.
But see, that was the brilliance of your plan as a spy, Dennis. All good spies know the best place to hide is in plain sight. So well done.
Well, it's something that I would not like to go through again. The interesting conclusion is that 30 years later, in 2015, the Czech Republic is now a democratic country. All players, or not all players, all people who were arrested by the STB, which was the equivalent of Russia's KGB, were entitled to apply to see their secret police files. So I sent the $50 fee over and I got a complete transcript of my trial emailed to me, and I read it over and it was bang on. I hate to say it, it was one of the biggest mistakes in my life, but the accuracy of the report indicated that they had more than one person spying on me.
Wow, you didn't know you were so important.
I would not have liked to have been.
But you didn't give up the secret of the how to win a face-off or the stretch pass, did you?
No, they were pretty good. By that time, they were pretty good at that themselves.
Okay. A few more things before we finish up, Dennis. One topic is I've read that you think European on ice officials, the European referees, get a bad rap when compared to their North American counterparts.
Well, when I made that statement, I was speaking about today. There's no question there was a time when they were inferior. In the 1950s and 60s, even as late as 1972, as we observed in the Summit Series with the guys like Joseph Kampala of Germany and Rudy Bata of Czechoslovakia. By that time, they had not advanced to the level of our officials, and I have no problem with the criticism that they took in those days. But, I mean, it's now 50 years later. They've had all kinds of training, mainly with the help of North American officials. And in my mind, from the games I have witnessed in recent Olympics, they're equivalent to our officials any day of the week. It's just a question of time. They needed to be trained and catch up.
I don't recall the name, but I believe the NHL now even employs one European referee.
We have, I'm not sure about this year, but we have had a Russian, at least a couple of Russian. I'm not sure whether they were linesmen or referees. They were here for a couple of years. I think they have gone back now, but they're certainly capable of doing the games here. Yes.
Something else eye-opening you've said, quote, the United States will eventually surpass Canada. Will the NHL one day, in the not too distant future, have more American players than any other nationality?
Yes, I believe that will happen. It doesn't mean that Canada is dragging its feet. Canada is doing quite well, but I think in the sheer population numbers and the growth of the game in the United States, I remember the days when hockey was mainly played in New England, Michigan, and Minnesota. Now it's being played regularly in California, Texas, Arizona, even Florida. And the U.S. national teams are getting good quality players out of there. So I think it's just a natural progression that someday that will happen. But I don't think it's any knock on Canada that that's the case.
Forgive me for asking you to speak for 30 million Canadians, but how should Canadians feel about that?
I don't think that they should even be concerned about it. There are a lot more issues more important in the world than hockey. I mean, look at the terrible tragedies that are going on recently: Afghanistan, Iraq, Ukraine, Turkey. I think if Canada can step forward and do its share in the way of aid and helping people in those areas, I don't think that they should worry that they fall behind in the overall production of NHL players. No.
All right. You do favor the larger size of international rinks, and I want you to speak to that. But first, I want to read someone you quoted, a former LA Kings defenseman named Kevin Dahlman. He pointed out that in Russia's KHL, quote, there's less physical play and less chance of getting hurt. That, Dennis, is a great reason, it seems to me, for a larger ice surface that I hadn't thought about before, that it could lessen the injuries of bigger, faster, and stronger NHLers playing on what seems to be an increasingly smaller ice surface.
Well, I'll start off by saying in North America, we have four major sports. We have baseball, football, basketball, and hockey. What's the one thing that hockey has that none of the other three have? It's skating. Nobody else wears skates. Gliding on a beautiful smooth surface. There is nothing nicer to watch for fans than skating. And the more ice, my view is that the more ice you have to work with, the more entertaining it is. And now many are going to argue with me. Many say that it takes a lot more skill to stick handle past an opponent on a smaller ice and outsmart a person and use body checking. I don't agree with that. I like the skating component of the game, the passing, the I'm a big soccer fan. That's one of the reasons that I like the larger ice surface in hockey. I really enjoyed the World Cup in November and December, and I'm a strategist, and I love to see the way the ball is moved around in to get a man open to take a clear shot. And I like the same thing in hockey, but unfortunately, not only is my opinion in the minority in Canada, it's now becoming a minority opinion in Europe, and European leagues are going down to what they call a hybrid rink.
Oh,
They're reducing the ice surface from the European size, not all the way down to the NHL size, but halfway.
hmm.
So they
Is that
are.
for economic reasons?
No, it's not. It's because that many in Europe who do not agree with me think that it provides a better game.
Hmm. By the way, soccer would benefit from a 2-minute diving penalty.
Yes, I would agree with that. Yes, there's a
Okay.
lot of diving. It's better than the Summer Olympics.
Okay. So, people who get your book, first of all, tell us how they can get it and tell me if there is one thing after they read it that you'd like them to take away from it, what it would be. So, give us all of that information.
I live in Burlington, Ontario. My phone number is 905-632-6101. I can reach me by email at dgibbons at Cogeco, that's COGECO.ca. And the one thing I'd like them to take away from the book is that how much enjoyment and growth, personal growth, you can experience by getting involved in a sport which is being played in another country. Because when you get there, you find out that it's not only the hockey game that you're learning about the customs, the culture, the music, politics, and the language. I have learned to speak Russian myself. I learned French in high school, but I now also speak a little bit of Czech. So it's very self fulfilling and something that shouldn't be ignored.
Denis Gibbons in 2014 was named recipient of the Society for International Hockey Research, the President's Award for dedication to the preservation of hockey history. And now we know why he earned it. Denis, thank you so much for your time. We have learned a lot from this master class in the past hour.
Thank you very much, Glenn. I appreciate your questions and good luck with your job with the Seattle Kraken.
I will tell them that you said hello.
Thank you.
Okay. And so long for all of us on Hockey Time Machine.
Thank you very much, Glenn.